Well, hello everybody. It's good to see your beautiful faces here once again. Just kidding. I can't actually see you through the screen, and quite frankly, I don't care what you look like. Everybody's welcome here. Anyway, February was a mixed bag. As far as the Ottawa real estate market is concerned, a pessimist would look at the stats for last month and say that the continued uncertainty around everything is having a cooling effect on the market. But an optimist could interpret those very same stats as an indicator that the market is really just preparing for liftoff, except the downtown condo market where everything still kind of sucks right now. Also, is Canada's impending mortgage renewal cliff, or mortgage renewal wall, or mortgage renewal fiery pit of despair set to tank our housing market and the country's economy along with it? A lot of reputable news outlets seem to think that could be the case, but what does the data say? We're going to tackle all of that and more in your March 2025 Ottawa real estate market update. You won't find any tariffs here, but we're still going to give it 125%. So without further delay, let's get to it, shall we? All right. We'll talk about this whole mortgage renewal, infinite pit of sadness or whatever, doom and gloom, in the second half of the video. But before we do that, let's see how Ottawa's freehold and condo markets fared last month. That would be February. And as always, we'll start the stats section off with our golden child, Freehold. He's German. All right, so let's get those February 2025 freehold sales stats up on the screen for you in 1, 2, 3. Boom goes dynamite. All right, there are the numbers. Now, what it means? Well, in February, we sold a measly 500 freehold homes here in Ottawa. Now, that was up from the 426 freehold sales we saw in January, the month that comes before February, but that's to be expected. This year's February total was, however, significantly lower than last year's February total of 573 sales. That's about a 15% drop. In recent years, in a typical February, we'd expect sales volume to fall somewhere between like the high 500s and the high 600s. So we're well short of our typical range this month, but then again, very little about this year has been typical, has it? In last month's market update, we talked about all the uncertainty right now regarding our tariffs and trade wars and even our own country's leadership situation. I encourage you to check that out if you haven't already. And so, if you wanted to be pessimistic about the market, you could point to this February's poor sales volume and say, see, all that uncertainty is just killing the market, right? But an optimist might argue that February's low sales total could also be due, at least in part, to the fact that interest rates are expected to continue dropping, which usually pushes prices up, right? And so a lot of people with quality properties to sell this year could just be holding off on listing them, thinking that the market's going to get a lot stronger in the months to come. I know I've certainly had a few of those conversations so far in 2025. Also, it is worth noting here that Ottawa spent a huge chunk of February just absolutely buried, really aggressive with the hand movements this month, absolutely buried in record amounts of snow. And we know that crappy winter weather does tend to hurt sales activity here, all right? So we might just be kind of delaying the start of the spring or the pre-spring market. That same optimist could also point to the fact that the average sale price of a freehold home in February came in at over $783K. That's slightly higher than January's average of $773K, and it's also the highest February average we've seen since the peak, which was in 2022. Just in case you're curious, February's average sale price in that peak year was an absolutely insane $892K. All right, that was literally the second highest average we've ever seen in Ottawa for any month ever. No February average before or since has come anywhere close to that. So yeah, take it for what it's worth. All right, moving on. Let's talk about inventory and sales to new listings ratios. All right, we'll start with inventory. Usual reminder here, inventory is not the same thing as supply. Inventory is a stat that accounts for both supply and demand all in one. Right? We measure inventory in months, and we use it as an indicator of whether we find ourselves in a balanced market, a seller's market, or a buyer's market. Okay? And in February, our freehold inventory levels dropped from 3.2 months down to 2.8 months. What that means is that for the month of February, demand was stronger than supply overall. right? Now, 2.2 months of inventory is also well within seller's market range, and it's another stat you could use to make an optimistic case for the freehold market. But February also saw our sales to new listings ratio drop to just under 46%. Now, sales to new listings ratio is another one of these stats that tells us about the relationship between supply and demand. Unlike inventory, however, when sales to new listings ratio drops, it's taken as a sign of a slowing market. And just to give you some added context here, a sales to new listings ratio of 46%, like the one we saw in February, is on the very low end of a range we'd expect in a balanced market. Anything below 40% would actually be an indicator of a buyer's market. So you're probably asking how these two somewhat similar stats can paint very different pictures of the supply and demand dynamics that exist within our market. What a good sentence. All right, and the answer is, I don't know, right? Just kidding. Of course I know, I've got a YouTube channel, for Christ's sake. The answer is that inventory compares the number of sales for a given period against the total number of active listings at the end of that period, right? So it's like a set point. Sales to new listings ratio, on the other hand, is more dynamic, right? It also takes the total number of sales for a given period, but it compares them to the total number of new listings that came to market within that same period. So they're similar, but not the same, right? And that's why they can sometimes paint different pictures. Now, neither stat is perfect, and like neither one is the better stat, in my opinion. And when they paint different pictures of the market, like they do this month, the truth about what's actually happening out there is usually somewhere in the middle. Cool? Hope that helps. All right, wrapping up Freehold here. The average time to sell in February was 34 days. That's well down from the 51-day average we had in January. So, yet another reason to feel optimistic about the freehold market. 34 days is at the low end of the range we'd expect in a balanced market. Anytime you get below 30 days, you're really kind of in seller's market territory. At least it's an indicator of a seller's market. Also, it's worth noting that freehold properties sold in February, on average, went for 99% of their asking price. That ratio is also really starting to get up there and could certainly be viewed as a sign that the market is heating up. So on the whole, I'd say our freehold market here continues to be a sort of weakish seller's market at the moment, right? And of course, with everything going on right now, things could certainly change on short notice in either direction. All right, so as always, your friendly reminder that trying to time the real estate market is a fool's errand, okay? Just buy when the time is right for you, and then after you buy, just don't pay any attention to what the market does in the short term. You'll feel much better for it, trust me. But of course, keep watching these videos, all right? Like and subscribe. All right, so that does it for freehold. Now let's move on to condos. But before we do that, we're gonna bring back an old favorite one time and let you know that this month's market update is brought to you by the U.S. men's hockey team. The U.S. men's hockey team, reminding us once again that you can't spell bum asses without USA. I asked them to pay me in Canadian dollars for that ad, but they insisted on paying in silver. All right, where were we? Yeah, condos, that's right. Okay, let's throw those February condo sales stats up on the screen for you. 1, 2, 3, Harukin. All right, so there were some similarities between the condo and freehold market trends last month, although, as has been the case for a while now, it's a lot harder to make like a super bullish case or like a super duper bullish case, if you want to just get crazy, for the condo market at this point in time, right? At least in comparison to freehold. We sold 203 condos in Ottawa last month. That was expectedly up from January, a month that comes before February. I think I already made that joke, where we sold 186 condos, but it was well below last year's February total of 231. All right, so again, about 15% below last year's Feb total. Also, 203 was the lowest February sales total we've had in the last 8 years, right? So yeah, not great, right? But once again, I do think last month's extreme weather played at least a small factor here. All right, moving on. The average sale price for condos in February was a little over $430K. That's down from January's average of 439K, and it's also below last year's February average of 433K. But, a lot of buts, as always, I remind you that for over 2.5 years now, condo prices here have essentially just been flat, right? And their average sale price has landed somewhere between about 410K and 455K in pretty much every month throughout that span, right? Which was once again the case in February of this year. So like, no big deal. Now, anyone who's looking to be a little more glass half full about our condo market could point to the fact that condo inventory came down in February, right? We went from 3.5 months of condo inventory at the start of February to 3.26 months of condo inventory at the end of February. It's like a small drop. It's also worth noting that 3.26 months of inventory is technically within what we'd consider to be seller's market territory. But, there it is again, when we break the condo market down into segments, right, we see that townhouse condos and really like anything outside of downtown is moving okay right now, right? It's the downtown apartment style condos that are really hurting, right? And those do represent a pretty huge chunk of Ottawa's overall condo supply. When it comes to those very downtown condo apartments, we currently have almost 7.5 months of inventory, which puts that segment in buyer's market territory, right? So those units are harder to move right now because there's a lot of competition from other sellers, which means there are opportunities out there for buyers who might be interested in that type of product, all right? So that was a silver lining. All right, wrapping up with condo stats here, we saw a sales to new listings ratio of 42.7% in February and an average time to sell of 51 days. Both those stats fall within balanced market territory, but they're also both closer to the buyer market side of the spectrum than the seller market side of the spectrum. All right, if we want to characterize the condo market for the entire city, I'd say that on average, it's a balanced market right now. Right? And that being said, and as we've just illustrated, anytime you're looking to buy or sell, it's important to dig down and examine neighborhood and property specific data rather than just relying on general citywide stats, right? So like talk to an expert, and of course, what better place to find an expert than YouTube? Huh? Expert. All right, that does it for the stats this month. Let's move on and talk about this whole mortgage renewal Death Star we seem to keep hearing about lately. Shall we? Let's get into it. I'm gonna set the table for you here. A real estate topic that has come up a lot lately, both in my day-to-day conversations and in the media, is this notion that Canada, and Ontario in particular, is on the precipice of a mortgage renewal cliff. Sounds pretty dramatic, right? And for those who may have heard the term mortgage renewal cliff or mortgage renewal wall or shock or whatever, but who aren't quite sure of what it all means exactly, allow me to lay it out for you. According to the Bank of Canada, roughly 60% of all residential mortgages in this country are set to renew at some point between now and the end of 2026. That's a fact, okay? Now, the bulk of these mortgages that are up for renewal are COVID mortgages, meaning they were obtained during a period in which Canadian interest rates were at like all-time lows, right? So, of course, all of these people who've enjoyed having a mortgage rate in the low twos and in some cases even lower for the last 5 years are now facing the reality of having to renew their mortgage at a rate that is going to be significantly higher by comparison, right? To give you an idea, the best rates at most big banks right now are somewhere in the 4s, okay? And so if you're currently paying an interest rate of say 2% or 2% and change on your mortgage, your interest rate is basically set to double once your renewal is up. So the thought process here is that, well, you know, these people, they're not going to be able to afford their new higher mortgage payments, right? And if people can't afford their payments, then they'll have to sell their homes or they'll just default on their mortgages and then the banks will sell the homes for them, right? And therefore, so the theory goes, we're about to see a bunch of these desperate sellers and bank sales just flood the real estate market, right? And that will cause say it with me now, a market crash. It's always a market crash. All right? And so that, my friends, is the mortgage renewal cliff theory in a nutshell, right? Okay. Now, we all know about the click generating prowess of a good doom and gloom real estate headline. And so, of course, most major news outlets are predictably running with this, right? Here are just a few of the headlines we've seen over the last few days, right? I don't know where Andrew's gonna put them on the screen. I'm just gonna look everywhere. All right. Okay, so you see the headlines. Now, how bad is this really? Are the people who've been sitting around since 2015 trying to time the market just right, calling for a crash, finally about to get their shot, right? Well, let's see what the data says, shall we? Huh? All right, oh, and just a quick little PSA here for any journalists who might be watching this. You too have the ability to check data. It's all free. It's like publicly available. It's right there on the internet where you publish your little articles, right? So, you know, sometimes the smartest articles are the ones you don't write, okay? Anyway, so what most of these articles are focused on is the fact that a recent report by the CMHC, that's the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation, right? The recent report found that in recent months, mortgage delinquency rates are way up across Canada, in particular in Ontario, where home prices are among the highest in the country. And again, those are facts, not contesting that, okay? Also, just another quick note for you here, a mortgage delinquency is defined as someone who fails to make their mortgage payment for 3 straight months, okay? And in Ontario, over the course of the last year or so, we've seen about a 50% rise in mortgage delinquencies. Right? So, well, damn, maybe those journalists were onto something after all. But hold on, let's examine what that 50% increase looks like in practical terms, again, with data, okay? So, according to the CMHC's data, in the first quarter of 2024, Ontario's mortgage delinquency rate was, wait for it, 0.15%. And as of right now, we're sitting at about 0.22%, aka a 50% increase, right? Technically true. So basically, 1 year ago, for every 10,000 people here who had a mortgage, you had 15 of them, 15 out of 10,000 that would fall into delinquency. And now it's 22. What are we doing? So I don't know about you, but that doesn't sound too dire to me, right? It feels a lot less dramatic than those headlines from earlier would have you believe, doesn't it, right? In fact, it sounds like we're kind of crushing it, right? Like we're doing really well at paying our mortgages in this country. And here's another thing. If the people who wrote these articles had actually looked at the data and gone just a little farther back, they could have actually made their headlines way more sensational, right? And that's because in the first quarter of 2022, Ontario's delinquency rate was just 0.07%. So just 7 people out of every 10,000 were falling into delinquency. Right now, we're at more than triple that, right? So instead of writing about a measly 50% increase in delinquencies, they could have called it a 300% increase, right? But, and here's the reality, that's mainly just because from 2020 to 2024, our delinquency rates in Ontario and throughout the rest of Canada hit 13-year lows. And I'm saying 13-year lows here only because CMHC's data only goes back that far. In reality, they were probably all-time lows, all right? And so I got curious, as I tend to do, and I started wondering what our delinquency rates looked like before that stretch from 2020 to 2024, where most people here benefited from super low mortgage rates, right? So I went back as far as the data would go, and I studied delinquency rates during the period that spanned from 2012 to the end of 2019. And what I found, ladies and gentlemen, is that in the 8 years leading up to COVID, the average mortgage delinquency rate in Ontario was, drum roll, 0.22%. Exactly what it is today. Right? So we are literally just back to normal, at least as far as that stat goes, right? And just to further hammer home my point here about how ridiculous this whole conversation is, If we look at the national data, Canada's highest mortgage delinquency rate over the past 13 years is 0.38%. That was in the second quarter of 2012. Now, if we compare that to the United States of America, aka the 11th Canadian province, over that same span of time, their lowest national delinquency rate was 1.7%, which came in 2023, which was once again when rates were super low, right? So our worst is still 4.5 times better than their best over that same period. And just in case some of you are still obsessed with this idea of mortgage renewals leading to a housing crash in Canada, keep in mind that before the US housing market crashed in 2008, their mortgage delinquency rates had already climbed up to levels that are over 15 times greater than where ours are right now. And then they more than tripled from there during the crash. All right, so we've got a long way to go before we're anywhere close to there, and we've never really been close to there, at least not in the last 13 years. So again, when it comes to paying our mortgages and winning at hockey, Canada just tends to crush it. All right, and so this whole notion of a mortgage renewal cliff to me is like way overblown, like way overblown. It sounds to me like it's really more of like a mortgage renewal pothole, right? Just to keep it Canadian. To put a nice little bow on this topic, it is also worth mentioning very quickly that Canada's mortgage stress test, which was introduced in 2016, forces anyone getting a mortgage here to qualify at a rate that is at least 2% higher than their mortgage's actual interest rate, and the qualifying rate used on any stress test cannot be less than 5.25%. Right? So everyone that has one of these COVID mortgages has literally already qualified for that same mortgage at an interest rate that is much higher than the one they'd likely get right now. Okay? And if you want to take your real estate situation higher than it is right now, I'd love to hear from you. Look at that smooth transition. You can contact me directly using the information below, or you can use the Calendly link in this video's description to directly access my calendar and book a super fun, no pressure discovery call at a time that works for you. That'll do it for this month, everybody. Stay safe, and thank you for watching. I'm Serge Papineau with the Papineau Group in Ottawa, and I hope to see you next month.